stand alone, 'cause unity's our resolution.
Alafia, I'm Dr. Gloria Lattimore Peace, host and producer of OmniU Presents the H3O Art of Life show. The title of this show is Examining Homicide and Suicide in the African American Community. And I have as my guest Dr. Carl C. Bell, who is staff psychiatrist, Jackson Park Hospital Family Medicine Clinic. I greet you warmly.
Thank you. It's nice to be greeted warmly.
Okay. I recently read an article that you penned, and there was so much information in it that I found that I was almost getting lost in it. But I wanted you to talk about the homicide and suicide rates in the African American community and what you talk about as field principles and what you also talk about as protective factors. And since you know all about it and I know little, I want you to just continue to talk until I raise my hand and decide I need to ask a question.
Okay.
Okay.
That's fine. So I went to Meharry Medical College in 1967, and it was very public health based because it was poor black school. So we didn't have nothing, and when you don't have nothing, it's easier to put a fire out early or prevent a fire than wait until the whole building is burned down. So they were very big on public health and prevention. And so we would pay very close attention to the leading causes of death in people. And of course, back in 67 and as far back as 1927, homicide has been a major cause of death in black people. So that's when I started studying this problem. Back then, not a lot was known about it because, as Dr. Satcher, the 16th Surgeon General, points out, nobody does research on black people because we're not important, we're not valued. And black people are so busy putting out fires, we don't have time to find out and to research ourselves about what's going on, which is a problem because then you don't fully and deeply understand what's going on. So it was actually at Meharry that this guy, black psychiatrist, that started in, Black Psychiatrists of America started in 67, and they were able to put a black psychiatrist in the Institute of Mental Health, which was a place that was supposed to study these problems, James Ralph. And Jim funded some researchers at Meharry, Ruth Dennis, and another guy, Harold Rose, up in Milwaukee, to study this problem so we could try to find out what's going on. And what became apparent was that the usual stereotype of a homicide, stranger, danger, wasn't accurate. It was predominantly family and friends who were killing people they knew. So for years and years, homicide was a very easy crime to solve. You just went to the husband, the wife. In fact, black women killed more black men than black men killed black women up until about 93. And then it shifted. And the reason it shifted was because women's shelters, domestic violence shelters, increased. And when you looked at the number of women, black women, that were in prison, half of them were there for killing some dude that had been beating them up for years. Just got tired of it, popped a cap in the brother, got rid of him. Even with that, and what we discovered as this research developed was that America's homicide rates were driven by the black homicide rates because they were always 6 to 12 times higher than the white homicide rates. At the same time, the black suicide rates, especially of black women, were very low. So the suicide rates in America run about 11 per 100,000 people. So it's a low rate behavior. The homicide rates are even less than the suicide rates.
That struck me
Yeah.
as being unusual, that homicide rates can be less than suicide rates when our experience seems to be that we keep hearing about all the homicides.
And that's because black people are falling for the flim-flam, hokey-doke that the papers, whereas I don't get my public health information from people trying to sell me something.
Okay,
I go to a scientific source,
okay.
not a secondary, tertiary source.
Why do we not get the statistics on a daily basis of the suicides happening?
Well, part of that is because there's research, Phillips did research that showed that there was this thing called contagion and cluster effects for suicide. So if there's a suicide and there's a big headline in the newspaper that talks about how the person did it, people in the community that are depressed will imitate that. And so schools of journalism like the Annenberg School of Journalism says, don't do that because you're going to increase the suicide rates.
Okay.
So they have enough sense to not do that. Suicide is by far a white problem, white elderly male to be specific. The black suicide rates have always been about half the white suicide rates, and black women have the lowest suicide rates of everybody in the country. When we did the Institute of Medicine Reducing Suicide report, which is online, in 2001, I asked this international and national group of suicide researchers, can somebody help me understand why black women got the lowest suicide rates of everybody in the country? Because black women catch hell. I know I'm a black male. I have ignorantly given them hell from time to time because, half-time brothers don't know what they're doing anyway. Certainly don't want to cause no grief. But black women catch hell. So why aren't their suicide rates higher? It's never been studied. Again, going back to Dr. Satcher's report, there's no research on black people, which is ignorant because then you don't find out solutions to problems. The homicide rates were probably 3/4 of the homicides were family, friend, acquaintances. And as the research progressed, what we began to realize was that there were multiple different types of homicides.
I saw that. Go
Good.
ahead. Yeah, go ahead and do that. I saw that in the report.
So there's mass murder where it used to be 3 or more people were getting killed. But recently the FBI jacked it up to 4 because they didn't want to have too many mass murder statistics. Serial killing, murder sprees, hate crime, where people hate people and they kill them. Interpersonal altercation, family friend arguments start. Predatory homicides like robbery homicides. Those, when people get robbed, most people don't want to kill the person they're robbing because if they get caught, it's worse. They just want the money and they're going to go. So they don't shoot you if they can help it. Drug-related homicide, of which there are 4 types of drug-related homicide. There's negligence, like drunk driving. There's economic, where you are trying to make money selling
So you can
drugs.
support a habit.
That's compulsory, where you get sick
Okay.
if you don't have your drug. So you go and kill somebody to get money to use the drug. Economic is where one drug dealer kills another drug dealer to get his turf. And then there's pharmacologic, where the drug causes you to be violent. Most of the drug-related homicides are economic. There's gang-related homicide. There's legitimate homicide. So if you try to kill me, I don't play that. I get to, if I can, I'm gonna take you out before you take me out. That's okay. That's legal. So there are all these different types of homicides.
But why do we see always in the paper gang-related or not? There never are any other shades of homicides. They're all either gang-related or maybe, as you mentioned, not a stranger danger, but people who know each other.
Again, I do not get my public health information from people
You
trying
told me
to
that already.
sell me
Okay,
something.
okay.
So the paper,
So they don't report it.
the paper is garbage.
Okay,
They don't know what they're doing. They're trying to sell newspapers.
okay.
Now, there is a dynamic here. So I guess it was 74 I started, and with Jim Ralph at the NIMH, we started doing a lot more homicide prevention, because it was, I don't know, the third leading cause of death in black people. And it killed black people younger. I once got into a conversation with Dick Gregory, and he was accurately pointing out that heart attack kills more black people, but it kills them when they're 70 and 80 if they make it that long. Whereas homicide will kill you at 15, so it's years' lives lost. So we started this whole homicide prevention issue strategy, because we noticed that women who had been raped, it wasn't a stranger rape most of the time. Most of the time it might be a date rape. Somebody you know. And the women were able to successfully shift the lens from stranger danger to watch out for your boyfriend. So we thought we would try the same kind of thing for homicide. Take away the predatory homicide fear and look at the issue of domestic violence homicides, in the hopes that we could shift the conversation from a criminal justice, they come after the death, to a prevention, public health, domestic violence relief. So we started trying to differentiate that for people in the hopes that we could enlist them to do more about things like domestic violence in the black community. And it kind of backfired, because Chester Pierce, who is a professor of public health, psychiatry, and education at Harvard, first guy to start the Black Psychiatrists of America, said to us at the time, don't say anything negative about black people, ever. Why not? White people will use it against you.
Okay.
So when we started trying to differentiate violence as a public health problem versus after the fact violence as a criminal justice problem, white people said, oh, black people are all violent. I used to have a t-shirt that said, stop black on black murder. And I was giving a lecture about this public health issue in Michigan, and a white female psychiatric resident said, you're a racist. You're trying to tell black people to kill white people. And I said, what are you talking about?
How did you get that?
She said, well, your shirt says stop black on black murder. I said, yeah, and? She said, well, if black people stop killing black people, they'll start killing white people.
Oh my.
So I chalked her up to being extraordinarily ignorant. But it was that kind of a thing that occurred, even though we crafted the messages very carefully. And it was right after that that the incarceration rates of black people went up 4 times in this country. So I think there was something that had to do with that in that way. Because everybody, and you know, the problem in Washington, D.C. was that there were not organized gangs like here in Chicago.
Okay.
So here in Chicago, the vice lords know where the gangster disciples and the Blackstone Rangers and the Latin Kid, everybody got their little turf,
Right.
right? In D.C., there were no organized gangs. And so when they started selling drugs, crack, there was a lot of economic gang-related violence as people tried to get drug-selling turf. Didn't have that in Chicago because the turfs were very well thought out. The problem was that the perception in D.C. was that the vast majority of homicides were drug-related, gang-related. So they put that out there, even though that was not the case, 12% maybe. And the nation said, oh, my Lord, we've got drug problems. Let's lock up all these black people because they're going to kill everybody. And of course, that wasn't the case. There was another dynamic, though, that occurred, which is confusing people now. So back in 67, 69, the domestic homicides in African Americans were like 16 per 100,000, which is still a low rate incident. It doesn't happen that often. When you got to 96, those rates dropped to 3 per 100,000, because again, domestic violence shelters increased. So there was a relative decrease in the interpersonal altercation homicides. The gang-related homicides stayed about the same. So now in a city like Chicago, since domestic violence homicides have decreased, the so-called gang-related homicides and the interpersonal altercation homicides are about 50-50, because the interpersonal altercations decreased so much. The gang-related homicides stayed the same. Even if you look into what they call gang-related homicides, half the time it's a gang member killing another gang member because of an argument they have.
Oh.
So it's interpersonal within the gang.
Mm-hmm.
So these things are very complex and they confuse people.
Right. I want to ask you about the fetal alcohol syndrome.
Yeah. So.
And its relationship to this.
Yeah. Thank you. That was like a softball question. So I'm studying this problem of homicide. And while I'm studying this problem of homicide, I'm seeing a fair number of children exposed to violence, which we started in '82, because that's what I was seeing. In fact, in '76, I saw my first 4-year-old who had seen her mother get stabbed to death, right? So I got to fix this problem. And so I've seen a lot of children exposed to violence. So we wrote about it. Me and Dr. Esther Jenkins wrote about it because we thought this was a problem. Because, you know, it's traumatic to see a parent get killed. And since most of the homicides were domestic, there were children present. So we started writing about children exposed to violence and the problems with education, causing violence, children exposed to violence, they perpetrate violence. And, you know, that got picked up by a lot of people in the country. And it's still being talked about and done. But when I was in medical school in 1967, black medical school with black professors, they pointed out to me that at that time it was called mental retardation, mild mental retardation, in low-income black people in the city of North Nashville was twice that of white people. And I'm like, well, what's that? And they thought that what it was what they referred to at the time, social cultural mental retardation. You know, because black people don't know nothing, we don't have books, we're not interested in education, and so our children are not being enriched to learn, and so they show up poorly on the IQ test. Plus, the psychologists were telling us IQ tests were biased, which they are. So what these two, the professor of pediatrics, E. Perry Crump, did with Julie Richmond, who was Carter and Johnson's Surgeon General, they started the Head Start program to fix the social, cultural, mental retardation, get the kids a head start. When I got back to Chicago after I left Meharry in '71, I started working at the Board of Education after I finished my psychiatric training. And it was still the same. And I saw these children who had bad tempers, speech and language problems, born premature. I'd done nutritional research in Nashville, a lot of prematurity. The prematurity rates in black people 2 to 3 times higher than in white people.
Really?
Nobody knows why.
Okay.
They got all these theories, but nobody does research, so nobody knows. These children that I saw in Chicago Public Schools were in EMH, TMH rooms, had ADHD, supposedly, had, again, explosive tempers, speech and language problems, all these memory, you know. And I knew that to be a brain problem from medical school.
Okay.
Not a psychological problem, a brain problem. But I didn't know what it was. So I go on and go on and go on, and I see this thing, this syndrome that I described. I've been seeing it for the last 50 years, didn't know what it was. Finally, in 2012, I saw a black woman who had been in DCFS, had been born premature, had a bad temper. What's 100 take away 7? Well, let's see, 84, this kind of thing. She had 3 kids in DCFS herself, and she just wasn't doing well. But I looked at her face, and in pediatrics, you're taught that children with fetal alcohol exposure have fetal alcohol faces. They have, their eyes look Asian, they don't have this groove from their nose to the top of their lip, this mid-face is flat. And I thought, she's got fetal alcohol exposure. And I realized that all these children I had been seeing over the past 50 years that had this very specific pattern of behavior, almost like, you know, it'd be real hard not to diagnose a guy missing his lower leg. It's kind of obvious, right? And that's how this constellation of symptoms was. But I didn't know what was causing it. Then it was shortly thereafter I went up to Manitoba, Canada, and found that the white people up there had taken the children of their Native Americans, 1840, stole their culture, which is a protective factor, sent them back to the reservation where they engaged in high rates of suicide, homicide, and alcoholism. And a lot of them had fetal alcohol. 19 out of 20 children in their juvenile detention centers, most of which were people of color, fetal alcohol exposure. So I began to put this together, finally. I'm kind of slow. And I realized that this was a problem, which I had not really thought about as a biological thing, because I'm listening to the social workers, the anthropologists, the psychologists. Went to St. Bernard, Jackson Park, just to check, and developed a screening form to identify patients with this problem. And in the first 100 people that I saw at St. Bernard, 32% had this problem.
Really?
And 28% had this problem at Jackson Park. So I then did a formal study at Jackson Park, because I left St. Bernard, and found that 4 out of 10 people that I see at Jackson Park have fetal alcohol, and they have explosive tempers, and they get into arguments with people, their family and their friends, and they wind up fighting or on occasion killing them and going to jail.
And this is because the mother drank alcohol during their
Pregnancy.
pregnancy.
But let me be very clear.
Mm.
Seen 500 women. I got about 1,000 patients with fetal alcohol. Their mothers, about half of them are still alive, taking care of 45-year-old men and women, 55, 35-year-old men and women, because these people cannot function. They can't work. They can't. They're very damaged. It's almost like having a child that has trisomy 21, Down syndrome. They're intellectually disabled. Leading cause of intellectual disability, fetal alcohol exposure. Talked to 500 women. Did you drink while you were pregnant? Oh no. That harms the baby. When did you find out you were pregnant? Oh, maybe a month. What were you doing the month before you found out you were pregnant? Well, I was at the club.
Mm-hmm. So they didn't know.
Didn't know. So I've only seen 3 people, one of whom I wanted to slap, but I'm a physician, so I can't slap my patients. Because she told me a story that really bothered me. But I've only seen 3 people who drank when they knew they were pregnant out of these 500. The difficulty with that conversation is that people make these assumptions that if a mother has a child that has fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, they were drinking all through pregnancy, and that's not the case.
Mm-hmm. If they drank at all, that would be detrimental to the.
Women know that.
Right, right.
Black women aren't stupid.
Right. You suggested choline.
It appears that
as a preventive
nutrient choline.
Okay.
So what happens is alcohol denatures choline
Okay.
in the mother's body. So the mother cannot send large amounts of choline to the developing brain.
Okay.
And so you wind up with a child that's premature,
Okay.
low birth weight, has a heart murmur.
Okay.
You find out when they get to kindergarten and or 2nd grade, they still don't know their colors
Okay.
because they're intellectually disabled.
Okay.
Very subtle, mild mental retardation, mild intellectual disability it's called now. But it appears that choline might help with the problem.
Okay.
The difficulty from a public health perspective is, public health, most people in public health aren't worth the dynamite to blow them to hell, because all they do is collect numbers and do statistics. They don't try to change anybody's behavior. They're really a big waste of time. Mind you, I'm a former professor of public health at the University of Illinois, but I don't care. Waste of time, people. They say educate. Okay, so most women know you're not supposed to drink when you're pregnant. Problem is they don't know for that month or two before
What is critical?
So I said, okay. Dr. Satcher, the Surgeon General, 16th Surgeon General, said, there are 2 types of prevention. There's psychosocial, where you teach people how to act.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard teaching people how to act. Hard to teach them how to wear seat belts, not cough in their sleeve when they cough. It's easy to give them a flu shot. Easier to pass a law saying you got to wear a seat belt. Those are biotechnical prevention strategies. They are easy to implement. So I looked around at the 25 top prenatal vitamins that have choline. 2 have choline. 2 have 50 milligrams of choline. 6 have 30 milligrams. The others have none. The daily required dose for choline, which is almost a vitamin B, is 450 milligrams a day.
Mm.
Well, if you're pregnant and you need a lot of choline and you're only getting 50 in the prenatal vitamin, why not have the prenatal vitamin companies put 450 milligrams choline in there?
Mm-hmm.
And that way, I think you've got a biotechnical, easy implementable strategy to reduce the number of 4 out of 10. Also turns out in places in Aborigine in Australia, it's 28%. In 4 rural communities in South Africa, it's 28 to 34%. So not only has there been cultural, sociological, psychological warfare on black people, there's also been biological. I was at a Native American lecture, and the Native American woman said, you know, the only business that's thriving on the res are the liquor stores.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Guess what's the only business thriving in black communities?
Same thing.
Liquor stores.
Right.
So it's there, it's available, it's a nice, cheap vacation. There's nothing wrong with social drinking, unless you're a month pregnant and don't know it, because the damage is done in the first 3 weeks. And if you're not eating, so it's a nutrition, genetic thing, alcohol, toxin thing.
But, you know, just I'm making this connection because you said motherhood was a protective factor against suicide. That women, I read that in the report.
Okay, if I
That-
said it, it must
okay.
sort of be true.
It's a protective factor so that prevents women care that they must live for their children. They must not commit suicide.
That's the theory.
That's the theory.
So when I ask black women, you know, black women, you've been catching hell, why haven't you tried to kill yourself? I ain't got time, I'm taking care of too many people. It's what I get back.
Okay.
The problem is that sometimes common sense ain't accurate.
Okay.
You gotta dig down scientifically. So for me, if there's ancient history, and there's stuff in the Bible about fetal alcohol.
Really?
Yeah, it's in Samson. When the angel goes to Samson's mother and says, don't drink.
Oh,
You're gonna have a son, don't drink.
okay.
So if it's ancient literature on it, if my personal experience confirms it, and then if science confirms it, if
Would
those
drugs be the same? Any other kind of drug, because alcohol is a drug, using drugs of any kind would affect?
I am completely unimpressed after 50 years of talking to women who've used cocaine, heroin. I am unimpressed that it does a fraction of the brain damage that alcohol does.
Really?
Yeah. Cocaine babies was a lie and a myth promulgated. Again, there's the media again. Looked in this study that I did on fetal alcohol, looked for lead, looked for infections, looked for traumatic brain injury as reasons why children would be intellectually disabled.
Mm-hmm.
Look for ADHD, look for autism. Turns out that there are 6 neurodevelopmental disorders of children, intellectual disability being the top, ADHD being next, speech and language, motor problems, autism, and there's another one that I can't remember. All of those 6, specific learning disorders, all of those 6, fetal alcohol exposure causes all of those 6.
Oh, really?
And children get diagnosed as being ADHD, and they don't have ADHD, they got fetal alcohol. So it's a pretty big mess.
As staff psychiatrists in a family medicine clinic, what kinds of patients do you see, and how do they come to you? How do you?
These are ordinary, average, everyday people who come.
They just walk in and ask for.
You know, a lot of times people come in who have fetal alcohol, and I say, why are you here? I'm depressed, I'm schizophrenic, I'm bipolar. They're none of those. What they are is intellectually disabled, and they don't know how to adapt or adjust to have a successful life, because they don't know how to adapt or adjust, they're unhappy, which they call depression, mistakenly. They go from 0 to 60 in 5 seconds, but it doesn't last for a full week, which you would need to be bipolar. It goes away after 2 hours, maybe.
So bipolar is something other than this then. Bipolar is not just somebody who is manic depressive or imbalanced, but it's more or less than that.
Bipolar is somebody who's manic depressive and imbalanced, but you stay that way for a full solid week.
Oh, it's
as
not
opposed to getting upset.
mood swings.
Mood swings, technically, mood swings are bipolar. Having a bad temper and having poor frustration tolerance, because you can't subtract 7 from 100,
Okay.
is not a mood disturbance. It's an
Okay.
emotional
Okay.
disturbance. It's affect dysregulation. But because people haven't been to medical school, they don't differentiate. And so most of my, 500,000 actually, patients with fetal alcohol exposure walking around thinking they're bipolar. And they're not. They got, and
So
you
the
know,
treatment will be different.
hopefully.
Oh, okay. You don't treat people, you just see them and let them tell you how they feel?
No, I'm still trying to figure out what medication might help their brain damage.
Okay.
I was in Prague last week, I guess, and there was a guy. The Canadians know so much more about this than the Americans do. But the white people in other countries are much more honest than the white people in America. The white people in Australia, New Zealand, and in Canada talk openly about their destruction of people of color's culture.
Oh.
When I was in South Africa doing HIV prevention research, 4 out of 10 Zulu people had HIV. 6% of the white South Africans had HIV. 1% of the East Indians had HIV. So we did this big study, $5 million, $2 million study, whatever it was, try to figure out how to keep these Zulu people from getting HIV. And at the end of the study, what it finally occurred to me, because like I said, I'm slow, East Indian people have a coherent culture. You go anywhere in the world and eat East Indian food, it's pretty much going to taste the same. Because they tell their children what to wear, who to marry, what gods to pray to, everything. When the white people got to South Africa, they destroyed Zulu culture. So it's no longer protecting them. So there is supposedly intergenerational transmission of trauma, but that's a deficit model. What's really going on is there's an absence of protective factors like culture.
Is one of them.
Yes. Tells you everything you're supposed to know.
So we've been here in America all this time without the protective factor of a cohesive culture.
Some of us have.
Some of us have. Well, who are the ones who have? Who are the haves and the have-nots?
I'm one of the haves.
You one of the haves.
Yeah, I don't have post-traumatic slavery syndrome. I don't have post-traumatic stress syndrome. I don't have none of that.
Okay, and you attribute that to?
I attribute that to my biology
Okay.
and my genetic stuff that I got from my father and my grandfather. My grandfather got his PhD from Yale in 1924. His grandfather told him, don't work for white people, they're crazy.
Okay.
So I've got a long line of black people that knew who they were
Okay.
and who,
And
you
you
know,
transmitted that to the next generation, who not only knew who they were, but made sure that their children knew who they were.
well, you know, life is complex.
Okay.
I've seen people who did not, so my mother and father got divorced when I was 2 years old. So I didn't have a lot of contact with my father or grandfather, but I knew our history because there
Okay.
were books in the house.
Okay.
And my grandfather, like I say, got his PhD from Yale. My father had a couple of PhDs. You know, there's a whole lot of real smart black people in the United States
Yes, I know.
that don't let white people construct their reality for them because they know better.
What do you mean by construct their reality? I think my viewers would be interested in that.
The newspapers are constructing black people's reality. They got black people so afraid of the homicide epidemic in Chicago, even though it's lower than it was 10 years ago.
I was surprised to read that. Okay.
So here's white people constructing black people's reality. They are not doing the things that we researched that would reduce the homicide problems. Social fabric, black people knowing people in the community. Whenever you're in a room with black people and they're trying to solve black people's problems, some old black person gets up and says, when I was growing up, if I broke a window, I'd be chastised by Miss Robinson.
Right.
That's social fabric.
Okay.
When the white people, when Chicago burned down, and all the waspy white people left, the Italians, Germans, and the Irish moved in. There was a delinquency problem and there was a domestic violence problem because they didn't know one another, so they weren't checking one another. Jane Addams, Nobel Prize winning
whole
social
house.
worker, came in and said, y'all need to get some neighborhood stuff going on here. And the Irish and the Italian and the German homicide rates and the delinquency rates went away. Same for black people, except black people are still having their reality constructed by white newspapers.
And television.
And television. I don't watch it. So the 7 field principles that we discovered in our solid research
Right.
for HIV prevention in South Africa and for violence prevention in black children were rebuilding the village, social fabric,
Yes.
biological, in this case that would be choline,
Right.
because it would decrease frustration tolerance and explosive tempers.
Right.
Being connected to a positive adult, having somebody mentor you and tell you what to watch out for in life.
Right.
Having self-esteem defined as a sense of power, a sense of models, and a sense of uniqueness. Having an adult protective shield around you, which in a lot of cases would be the neighborhood, because, you know, children are terrorists. They will drive you absolutely insane. So you need more than one person helping you raise your child.
Absolutely. Single family households, single parent households are not
Well,
the
Chef
best way.
Kellen's research in Woodlawn showed that single-parent household children did just as well as two-parent household children if there was social fabric around the single-parent household children,
Right.
because it's a protective factor.
Right.
Minimizing trauma, how do you turn helplessness into helpfulness?
Okay.
So those are the 7 field principles.
Okay.
Social emotional skills.
I
Gotta know
just
how to
have to
talk to
ask
people.
you this question, even if you don't get long enough to answer it. See, if suicide by cop, I just wondered how anybody ever thought of that label, that somebody would deliberately try to get themselves killed.
What
by a
I have
cop.
understood when that cop shot that child had issues. Who in their adult, mature, right mind pisses off a Chicago cop with a gun? Who does that? People with poor judgment. People with fetal alcohol exposure have poor judgment. I saw a guy who had been locked up 13 times for selling drugs. I said, how'd you manage that? He said, I don't know. I went to my favorite corner and the police always found me there. Poor social judgment.
Suicides in jails.
They're higher because people get
But-
upset.
But some of the so-called suicides in jails are highly suspect.
I hear you. But you gotta, it's both and, it's not either or.
Okay.
I think that 75% of the children in the juvenile detention center have fetal alcohol exposure.
Okay.
I got some evidence for that. I've got some evidence for 75% of the children in special ed have fetal alcohol exposure.
Okay.
There is evidence in some Canadian studies in jails and prisons. Matter of fact, we surveyed the entire state of Texas prison population. 20% of the inmates had room temperature IQs. They were not bright. What was that? That's fetal alcohol exposure. So if you're easily upset, if you get locked up and you get frustrated, oh, I'll kill myself. The life expectancy of somebody with fetal alcohol syndrome, which is the most exposure, is 34 years
I
old.
saw that, yes.
20% of it is suicide. So my sense of why suicide rates in jails are 8 times higher than in the general population is fetal alcohol.
Well, that's certainly as good a reason as any that I can think of for a female to be very careful about using alcohol at all, especially one who's in her childbearing years. Going to the club might not be the best place for you to go if you're likely to give birth to somebody.
I understand, but if you are not too bright yourself, and if your mother was drinking before she knew she was pregnant, and if you're 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, children don't fully get their brains fully developed till they're 26. So children in my world are all gasoline, no brakes and no steering wheel. And it's the neighborhood people around them that have to be their brakes and their steering wheel till they get to be 26.
Okay.
That's how it's supposed to work.
Okay.
It's not working in the 6 most well-known neighborhoods in Chicago where 85% of the homicides occur, which is where all the liquor stores are.
Right.
And we know this problem could be fixed, but it would cause a major shift in social policy and the value that people put on people of color, which,
Can people of color start by placing value on themselves?
that would be my idea.
And they're young.
That would be my idea. The problem is that people of color, all people get distracted by fluff and flim-flam and bamboozle. So they're, oh my God, we've got a gang problem. Oh, it's all drug related. Oh, it's the robbers that are killing all these people. No, I'm sorry.
You're sorry.
It's not. It's interpersonal altercation is still 50%.
Okay, it's fetal alcohol syndrome.
So behavior is complex. There's not a silver bullet. It's multiple factors. Fetal alcohol is one of the base factors. I have this funny feeling that fetal alcohol exposure is probably done more damage to black people than being captive.
Well, see, now we're at the end of the show, and there are all kinds of other things I want to ask.
It's all in print. Read, black people, read.
Well, I read all the time, sir.
Keep doing. No, I'm not talking to you.
But I'm trying to see how I can translate fetal alcohol syndrome into being at the root or at strong influence in the captivity of people of African descent. We weren't over in Africa getting high.
Yeah, but when white people came and they wanted to stable black culture, Native American culture, Aboriginal
Then they introduced
culture,
alcohol.
they poured the alcohol in.
Exactly. I've seen that. That's more vivid in my recollection of Native American.
It's
Yeah.
also it's
It actually transforms. It transforms people into different people. You know,
it damages their brain.
right? And brain tissue does not regenerate.
It does.
It does,
It's
but
just slow and takes a long
okay.
time. And
well, better not to.
depending on how damaged it is, you kind of doomed.
Okay, I thought brain tissue was irreversible. Damage to brain tissue was irreversible. Well, why bother to try to reverse it? Why get it in the first place if you can avoid it?
Prevention, prevention, prevention.
Yeah. Oh man.
I didn't make you unhappy.
No, you didn't. You can't make me unhappy.
But you're right.
Right. So.
I'll give you an out though.
Well, I can tell you that you shed a lot of light, including the light on the destruction of alcohol and the proliferation of businesses that sell alcohol, including grocery stores. You know, you can always, if you might live in a food desert, but you don't live in an alcohol desert. You
No,
can
you
buy
live in an alcohol swamp.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Social determinants of health is real cute, but it should be science-based as opposed to cosmetic. I know we're in Chicago, but black people live in liquor swamps. Food deserts, I'm not as impressed. Sorry.
Okay. Are you optimistic at all about the future of our people in terms of recovering the village, rebuilding it?
You know, I used to struggle with Du Bois's Talented Tenth.
Okay.
I found a letter from my father, I found a letter from my father and my grandfather to Du Bois. My Du Bois wanted my grandfather to send him a picture. My grandfather said, I have time for that. I'm trying to do something serious.
Okay.
So this Talented Tenth stuff, because I love black people.
Okay.
I grew up with them, you know? So I didn't want
You're
to,
one of them.
and I'm one of them. So I didn't want to trash 90%,
Okay.
but I'm starting to rethink Du Bois.
Well, now they put the show's logo up, which means that they didn't let you say that
That's
you
good.
didn't
I don't want to
trash.
get in trouble with black people.